Most players spend their chess careers thinking about knights, bishops, and queens. The pawns? They get moved out of the way. But the players who never quite crack the game often share one blind spot, and it has nothing to do with tactics. The form they take, the pawn structure, quietly steers the whole game, influencing your plans before you even realize it. This video is a deep dive into how pawn structures work and why they matter so much. A single doubled pawn can quietly rewrite your entire strategy. Files open and close as pawns move, and the moment the structure shifts, your whole plan shifts with it. Along the way, you'll see how these patterns guide every phase of the game, from opening principles to middle game and endgame applications, common structure types, strategic transitions, and common mistakes. Understanding them separates players who react from players who plan. By the time we're done, you'll start to notice the backbone behind every position. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Pawn Basics. More than just infantry. Each player starts the game with 8 pawns. They sit on the 2nd rank for white and the 7th rank for black, forming a line across the board before a single piece has moved. But the pawn is where chess structure actually begins, and understanding how it moves is the first step toward understanding why positions look the way they do. The pawn's movement rules are simple to state, but worth thinking through carefully, because they are unlike any other piece on the board. A pawn moves forward. That is it. Not sideways, not backward, not diagonally when it moves. Only forward, one square at a time, along the file it sits on, and only into an empty square. If a piece is standing directly in front of a pawn, the pawn cannot move at all. It is blocked completely. This is different from every other piece in chess, which can either capture what is in front of it or move around it. The pawn just stops. Capturing works differently from moving. When a pawn captures, it moves one square diagonally forward onto a square occupied by an opposing piece. So the pawn moves in one direction, but captures in another. This means a pawn can be blocked by an enemy piece directly ahead, while simultaneously threatening the squares on either side. That separation between movement and capture is one of the things that makes the pawn mechanically unusual. There is one exception to the one square rule, and it applies exactly once per pawn. On its very first move from its starting square, a pawn may advance 2 squares instead of 1, as long as both the square it passes through and the square it lands on are empty. Once that pawn has moved, the 2 square option is gone permanently for that pawn. It does not come back. Every subsequent move for that pawn is 1 square forward. This 2 square option exists to speed up the opening. Without it, the pieces behind the pawns would take much longer to develop. But it also introduces a specific tactical situation that needed its own rule to handle. That rule is en passant. Here is the situation it addresses. Suppose your pawn is sitting on the 5th rank. An opposing pawn on an adjacent file is still on its starting square. That opposing pawn advances 2 squares, landing right beside yours. Because it skipped over the square your pawn would have captured on, it has effectively avoided being taken. En passant says you can still capture it, but only immediately. On the very next move, you can move your pawn diagonally forward onto the square the opposing pawn passed over, and the opposing pawn is removed from the board. If you do not take en passant on that move, the opportunity is gone. En passant is not an exception to the pawn's logic. It is actually consistent with it. The rule treats the 2 square advance as if the pawn had only moved 1 square, restoring the capture that would have been available. The key conditions are that your pawn must be on the 5th rank. The opposing pawn must have just made a 2-square advance from its starting square, and you must act immediately. Now, the mechanical rules are clear. But there is something more important to notice about how these rules combine. The pawn cannot go backward. This is stated plainly in the rules, but its implications go well beyond a simple restriction. Every other piece in chess can retreat. A knight that moves to a bad square can come back. A bishop that goes to the wrong diagonal can be repositioned. A rook can slide back down the file it just opened. The pawn has no such option. Once it moves, it stays on that square until it captures, gets captured, or advances further. It never returns to where it was. This makes the pawn fundamentally different in kind, not just in power. Other pieces are mobile tools that you reposition as the game changes. The pawn is a structural commitment. When you push a pawn, you are not just making a move. You are making a permanent alteration to the board. This is why chess teachers often advise against unnecessary pawn moves, especially early. It is not that pawn moves are bad. It is that they are irreversible, so each one deserves more consideration than it might appear to warrant. Now consider how the pawn is valued in material terms. A pawn is worth 1 point. That is the baseline unit in the standard material scale. Knights and bishops are worth around 3 points each. A rook is worth around 5. A queen is worth around 9. By that measure, the pawn is the least valuable piece on the board. But material value and positional influence are not the same thing. A pawn sitting on a central square does something that its 1-point value does not capture. It occupies space. It attacks the squares diagonally in front of it. It forces opposing pieces to work around it or challenge it directly. A pawn on e4 attacks d5 and f5. An opposing knight that wants to use those squares has to find another route. That is concrete, lasting influence on the position, and it comes from a piece worth 1 point. François-André Danican Philidor, one of the strongest players of the 18th century, wrote in his 1749 treatise that pawns are the soul of chess. That phrase has been repeated ever since, and it remains as relevant today as when he wrote it. Philidor understood that the pawns define the character of a position in a way that the pieces do not. The pieces move around. The pawns stay put and shape the territory the pieces have to work in. That shaping is what makes pawn placement so consequential. When pawns occupy central squares, they claim space. The side with more central space often has more room to maneuver pieces, more options for where to place them, and more control over where the action happens. When pawns are pushed to the side or left undeveloped, the center can be taken over by the opponent, and the pieces end up cramped or passive. Pawn placement also creates long-term weaknesses. A square that a pawn has moved past can no longer be defended by another pawn. If an opposing piece settles on that square, it may be very difficult to dislodge. These weak squares are a direct consequence of pawn moves, and because pawns cannot go back, those weaknesses are permanent unless the opponent makes their own pawn moves to change the structure. This is the core shift in how to think about pawns. The question is not just what a pawn is worth in material. The question is what the pawn's position does to the board. Does it control important squares? Does it restrict opposing pieces? Does it create weaknesses in your own position that will be hard to defend? Those questions have answers that go well beyond the 1-point label. The pieces are mobile and flexible, but they operate within a framework that the pawns define. Where the pawns sit determines which squares are safe for pieces to occupy, where attacks are likely to happen, and how open or closed the position is. Change the pawn structure, and you change the nature of the position entirely. The pieces can be reorganized. The pawns set the boundaries. That is why every pawn move is worth pausing over. Not because pawns are more powerful than pieces in a material sense, but because their placement is more permanent. The rules that govern the pawn, moving only forward, capturing only diagonally, never retreating, are not limitations that make it weak. They are the source of its structural weight. The pawn's inability to go backward is exactly what makes its position matter so much. Chapter 2. Defining pawn structure. When you examine a chessboard mid-game, the pieces are in constant motion. Knights leap, bishops glide along diagonals, and rooks traverse the board. Meanwhile, pawns remain largely stationary, forming a lattice that defines the board's landscape. This lattice is known as the pawn structure, a crucial aspect of any chess position. Pawn structure refers to the collective arrangement of all pawns on the board at a given moment, considering both sides as a formation rather than individual pieces. Sometimes called the pawn skeleton, it shapes the chess position, determining where open space exists, where congestion occurs, and which squares pieces can reach. The key shift here is from focusing on individual pawns to viewing them as a group. While it's common to consider a single pawn's safety or advancement, pawn structure requires a broader perspective. What does the entire formation signify for the position? The answer reveals much about the game, such as whether the position is open or closed, where weak squares are located, and what plans might be viable, often before piece placement is considered. This shift in perspective is transformative, altering how you perceive the board. Many players initially view pawns like any other piece, asking tactical questions about individual pawns. However, understanding pawn structure involves interpreting what the entire arrangement communicates about the position, a skill that can be learned by observing the board closely. The starting position provides every game with the same pawn structure: white's pawns on the second rank, and black's on the seventh. From the first pawn move, this structure begins to change, and it never reverts to the baseline. Each game diverges from this starting point, creating a unique structure specific to that game. Pawn structure's significance often surprises players by how early it matters. Many assume it's an endgame concern, but it influences the game's character from the outset. The central pawn pattern, for example, dictates whether the position is open or closed, affecting piece dynamics. Bishops excel in open positions, knights in closed ones, and rooks require open files. These dynamics stem directly from the pawn structure, present from the game's earliest stages. Philidor's assertion that pawns are the soul of chess captures this idea. Pieces operate within the framework created by pawns, a framework that influences the game long before the endgame. While pawn structure is relatively stable compared to piece movement, it is dynamic and evolves as the game progresses. Each pawn move or capture permanently alters the structure. When a pawn advances, it leaves its original square and commits to a new one. An exchange opens a file, potentially becoming a lasting feature of the position. These changes accumulate, with the middle game structure reflecting opening decisions and the endgame structure embodying the entire game's history. The significance of this accumulation lies in the irreversibility of pawn moves. Pieces can be repositioned, but pawns cannot move backward. Once exchanged, they are gone. Thus, every pawn decision is also a structural decision, whether recognized as such or not. This is where players often struggle. A pawn move made for immediate tactical reasons can have lasting structural consequences. The tactical situation may resolve, but the pawn's new position remains, influencing the game for many moves. This distinction between tactical and structural pawn moves is crucial. The same move can serve both purposes, achieving a tactical gain while altering the structure. Strong players consider both layers simultaneously, evaluating not just immediate effects, but also the long-term position created and whether it aligns with their strategy. They sculpt the structure through a series of small decisions that gradually shape the formation to support or undermine their plans. The pawn structure established after the opening phase often defines the strategic landscape of the middle game. The central pawn formation, in particular, carries significant weight. Whether the center is open, closed, or semi-open determines subsequent play. Piece activity, king safety, and control of key squares are all influenced by the central pawn structure, which is usually set early, giving early pawn decisions disproportionate influence over the game's progression. A subtler point is that pawn structure determines piece value in a specific position. A seemingly powerful bishop may be ineffective if blocked by pawns on its color, while a modest knight may become formidable with a stable outpost. Pieces exist within the framework created by pawns, and their effectiveness depends on how well that framework suits them. Pawn structure is often described as the most important positional concept in chess. Not because individual pawns are powerful, they are the lowest valued units, but because their collective arrangement shapes everything else. The structure reveals open files, weak squares, useful diagonals, and realistic plans. It doesn't tell you everything, but it provides more insight than almost anything else at a glance. Reading pawn structure is a skill developed with practice. The foundation is simple. Shift focus from individual pawns to the entire formation. Consider what the arrangement communicates, what it has created, and what it has closed off. Recognize whether the structure is changing, and what those changes are building toward. This shift in attention, from individual pieces to the collective pattern, unlocks the strategic layer of the game. Chapter 3: The impact of pawn structure on game dynamics. Understanding what pawn structure is and how it forms leads to the next question: what does it actually do? Rather than just sitting there, a formation reaches outward across the board, shaping the movement and influence of every other piece. This chapter delves into that influence. Start with the most basic version of that influence. A pawn sitting on a square controls the two diagonally forward squares in front of it. Those are the squares it would capture on. That means any opposing piece that wants to land on one of those squares has to account for the pawn. It cannot simply move there as if the pawn were not watching. The pawn is watching. And because pawns cannot move backward, that diagonal control does not shift or disappear on a whim. It stays in place as long as the pawn stays in place. That reliability is what makes pawn control meaningful. A piece attack is temporary. A pawn's control of a square is structural. This distinction matters more than it might seem at first. When a piece attacks a square, the attack lasts only as long as the piece stays put, and pieces move constantly. But a pawn's influence on its forward diagonals is anchored to the board. If a pawn sits on e4, the squares d5 and f5 are under its watch for as long as that pawn remains on e4. An opposing knight that wants to land on d5 has to factor that in. An opposing bishop that wants to use d5 as a transit point has to factor that in. The pawn is not just occupying one square. It is casting a shadow over two more. Now multiply that across the whole board. Every pawn on both sides is doing this simultaneously. The result is a network of controlled squares that defines where pieces can comfortably go and where they cannot. This network is not something either player consciously draws, but it is always there, and it is always shaping movement. The pawn skeleton, as a whole, creates the architecture that all the other pieces operate within. One of the clearest places to see this is with knights. A knight moves in an L shape and cannot be blocked by pieces standing between it and its destination. So the only way to restrict a knight is to control the squares where it wants to land. Pawns do exactly that. A knight in the center of the board has up to 8 squares it could jump to. If several of those squares are controlled by enemy pawns, the knight's real options shrink. It is not blocked in the traditional sense, but it is pushed away from the squares where it would be most effective. The pawn structure is quietly deciding the knight's movements. This is also where the concept of an outpost becomes concrete in practice. As established earlier, an outpost is a square that no enemy pawn can attack, existing because the pawns that could theoretically contest it have either moved past it or are simply not on the files that would cover it. A knight placed on an outpost cannot be driven away by a pawn. It sits there stably, often deep in the opponent's position, and the pawn structure is the reason it can do that. The outpost did not appear because a player decided it would be nice to have one. It appeared because the pawn formation created a gap in the opponent's pawn coverage, and that gap became a permanent feature of the position. The same logic applies to long-range pieces, though in a different way. Bishops, rooks, and queens move along lines, and pawn placement determines whether those lines are open or blocked. In a position where pawns have been exchanged and files have opened up, a bishop has clear diagonals to work with, and a rook has open files to occupy. In a position where pawn chains are locked and the center is closed, those same pieces find their paths obstructed. The pawns are not moving. The pieces have to work around them. A bishop that is hemmed in by its own pawns, on the same color squares it travels on, is a fundamentally different piece than a bishop with open diagonals ahead of it. The board looks the same in terms of piece count, but the pawn structure has made one bishop strong and the other nearly inert. This is why open and closed positions are defined by pawn arrangement rather than piece placement. The pawns determine the terrain. The pieces respond to it. Once you see how pawn structure governs square control and piece mobility, the next step is recognizing that it also governs strategy. Not just in the sense of suggesting a plan here or there, but in the deeper sense of defining which plans are actually viable and which ones are not. A player cannot simply choose any strategy they find appealing. The pawn structure imposes a logic, and plans that work against that logic tend to fail. If the pawns point toward one side of the board, that is usually where the natural expansion lives. If a cluster of pawns has locked the center, direct central breakthroughs become difficult or impossible without significant preparation. The structure is rarely just a suggestion. It functions as a constraint. This is especially visible in fixed or locked pawn formations, where opposing pawns are blocked against each other and neither side can easily exchange them. In those positions, the range of viable plans narrows considerably. Direct pawn advances in the locked area are not available, so both players tend to shift their attention elsewhere, either to a flank or to piece maneuvering aimed at improving their position without changing the pawn structure itself. The structure has effectively told both players where the action cannot happen, and they have to work within that. The important thing to notice is that both players are reading the same structure When you look at the pawn formation and identify a weak square in the opponent's position, a square that no enemy pawn can cover, you are identifying a target. But the opponent is looking at the same board. They see the same weaknesses. They also see your weaknesses. Strategy in chess is not invented in isolation. It is derived from the shared reality of the pawn structure, and both sides are deriving their plans from it simultaneously. Understanding the structure is therefore also a way of understanding what your opponent is trying to do. This is where structural imbalances become relevant. When the two sides have different pawn formations, they often have different sets of strengths and weaknesses. One side might have more space due to advanced pawns, which supports an expansion plan. The other side might have more piece activity, because the structure has given them better outposts or open files. These asymmetries mean that two players are often pursuing completely different goals at the same time, and both goals are rational, given the structure each player is working with. One player pushes forward. The other looks for counterplay. Neither is playing randomly. Both are following the logic the pawns have established. Pawn structure also affects the relative value of pieces in ways that go beyond the standard point counts. A bishop whose diagonals are blocked by its own pawns is worth less than its nominal value suggests. A knight in a closed position with a stable outpost may be worth more. A rook on a half-open file has more practical power than a rook buried behind its own pawns. The point values are a starting estimate, but the pawn structure adjusts those estimates in every specific position. When experienced players talk about one side having the better pieces, they often mean the pieces are better suited to the structure, not that the pieces themselves are inherently superior. The way to approach any middle game position is to start with the pawns. Look at where they are, what squares they control, what squares they have left undefended, and what lines they have opened or closed. That analysis tells you what the position is asking for. It tells you where the natural targets are, which pieces are well placed, and which are mismatched to the structure, and which areas of the board are likely to become the focus of play. Every piece decision, every plan, every maneuver flows from that reading. The pawns are the foundation of the game, shaping every move and strategy. Chapter 4: Pawn Structures and Opening Principles. The relationship between pawn structure and piece activity holds across every phase of the game. What is worth examining now is when that relationship first takes hold, because it does not begin in the middle game. It begins with the very first pawn moves. The opening is often described as a race to develop pieces, get the king to safety, and control the center. Those goals are real. But they can create a misleading picture if they suggest that pawn moves in the opening are just a means of clearing space for pieces to come out. The pawn moves in the opening are not preparation for the real decisions. They are the real decisions. Each one begins fixing the structural skeleton that every subsequent piece move will either work with or struggle against. The first few pawn moves immediately start determining which central squares are controlled and which are surrendered. A pawn placed in the center does not just occupy one square. It controls the two squares diagonally in front of it, and it blocks the squares behind it from being used as development routes for bishops. That combination of control and obstruction means a pawn move in the opening is always doing two things at once: claiming something and closing something off. Recognizing both sides of that exchange is what makes opening pawn decisions genuinely strategic, rather than automatic. Consider the relationship between pawn placement and piece development routes. Bishops cannot jump over pawns. They need open diagonals to become active, and those diagonals are either available or blocked, depending entirely on what the pawns have done. A bishop sitting behind its own pawn chain is not a weak piece because of anything the bishop did. It is restricted because the pawn structure has closed the lines it would otherwise use. This is why the structure created in the first several moves of a game often determines whether certain pieces will be active contributors or passive bystanders well into the middle game. Knights are different. They can jump over pieces, so they are less dependent on open lines. But they are still shaped by pawn structure in a different way, because their value depends heavily on having stable squares to land on. A knight placed on a strong outpost can be enormously powerful. A knight with no such square available is forced to stay mobile and often ends up contributing less. Those outpost squares are created or destroyed by pawn placement. The early pawn moves in the opening are already deciding, sometimes irreversibly, where the knights of both sides will find their best homes. Rooks present a slightly different case. They need open files to become active, and open files are typically the product of pawn exchanges. In the early opening, rooks are typically not yet in play. But the pawn decisions being made in those first moves are already determining which files will open up later, and which will stay blocked. A player who thinks ahead about where rooks will eventually want to operate can make pawn decisions that prepare those files. A player who does not think about this often finds their rooks passive for a long time, waiting for a structure that never quite opens the right way. This is the core of what makes pawn structure so influential in the opening. Piece placement is not a free choice. It is constrained by what the pawns have already decided. A player who develops pieces without thinking about the pawn structure may find those pieces awkwardly placed, lacking support points, or blocking the very lines they need to use. The structure comes first. Piece placement follows from it. The relationship also runs in the other direction, and that is worth being clear about. Sometimes a player makes a pawn move specifically to support a piece they want to place on a particular square. In that case, the intended piece placement is driving the pawn decision. But even then, the pawn move is the one with lasting consequences. The piece can move again. The pawn cannot go back. So even when a pawn move is made in service of a piece, it is still the pawn move that fixes the structural reality going forward. That asymmetry is what makes opening pawn decisions carry so much weight. Every pawn move in the opening is a structural commitment that will still be present dozens of moves later, long after the pieces have shifted and reorganized many times over. The structure formed in the opening does not disappear when the opening ends. It persists as the underlying framework for everything that follows. Now, recognizing that pawn moves carry long-term consequences is one thing. Knowing how to evaluate those consequences in the moment is another. The key question to ask about any opening pawn move is not just what it does right now, but what structural profile it is committing to. Every pawn advance claims space, but it also fixes a new set of relationships that cannot be undone. Space is genuinely valuable. A player with more central space has more room to maneuver pieces, more options for where to place them, and more pressure on the opponent's position. But space comes at a cost. Pawns that advance cannot retreat, so an advanced pawn is also a pawn that is further from its supporting neighbors. If the opponent can attack that advanced pawn before it is adequately supported, the space gain becomes a liability. The pawn that looked active now needs defending, and defending it may require awkward piece placement or further pawn commitments that compound the problem. This tension between gaining space and maintaining flexibility is one of the central strategic considerations in opening play. Flexibility means keeping options open, not committing to a structure until the position demands it. A player who advances pawns aggressively in the opening may gain space, but surrender the ability to adapt if the position changes. A player who holds back may keep more options available, but cedes central ground that is hard to reclaim later. Neither approach is inherently correct. The right balance depends on what the specific position is asking for. A common mistake is to treat an active-looking pawn move as automatically a good one. Activity is not the same as structural soundness. A pawn advance that grabs space but creates a weak square behind it, or leaves a pawn isolated without neighboring support, may look energetic in the short term, while generating a long-term problem that is very difficult to solve. Weak pawns, as established earlier, tend to be permanent. An isolated pawn created in the opening will still be isolated in the endgame unless the position changes in a specific way that resolves it. That permanence means the structural cost of an unsound pawn advance does not fade with time. It accumulates. Pawn tension is another dimension of this. That tension is a kind of open question. Neither side has yet committed to a specific structural outcome. Capturing resolves it and fixes the structure, opening a file and determining which squares will be weak or strong going forward. Maintaining the tension keeps the question open, preserving flexibility, but also deferring the structural clarity that both sides need to coordinate their pieces effectively. The decision to capture or hold is not just a tactical choice. It is a structural one, because whichever way it resolves, the resulting pawn formation will shape the character of the position from that point forward. What this means in practice is that every opening pawn move deserves a structural question before it is played. Not just what does this do right now, but what does this commit to? What squares does this advance create or weaken? What lines does it open or close? What pawn tension does it generate, maintain, or resolve? And what structural profile is this building toward? That habit of asking structural questions about pawn moves is not a matter of memorizing opening theory. It is a way of reading the board that applies regardless of which opening arises. The specific moves change from game to game. The structural logic behind them does not. A player who understands what each pawn move is committing to structurally can navigate unfamiliar positions with genuine understanding, rather than relying on remembered sequences that run out after a few moves. The opening is where structure is born. Each pawn move in those early stages is a brushstroke on the canvas of the game, setting the tone and direction for the unfolding masterpiece. Chapter 5. Pawn Structures in the Middle Game. Imagine reaching the middle game with a board that has transformed from a landscape of possibilities into a map of established facts. The captures have been made, the chains have been formed, and the open files are already there, or they are not. What was a future consideration in the opening has now become the active framework governing every decision on the board. That shift matters because the middle game is where structure stops being background and starts being the thing you are actually working with. Attack lines, defensive responsibilities, piece placement, long-term plans, all of it flows directly from the formation already in front of you. The question is no longer what structure are we building toward. The question is, what does this structure tell me to do right now? The first thing the pawn formation tells you is where the action belongs. Open and half-open files, previously defined, serve as corridors for rooks and queens to generate pressure. If you have a rook sitting on a closed file with no way through, it is not contributing much. But place that rook on an open file pointing toward the opponent's position, and it becomes a real problem for them to deal with. Here, the rook's effectiveness is a direct result of the structure. The direction of a pawn chain guides your strategy. A pawn chain tends to point toward the side of the board, where the player controlling it has natural attacking chances. This is not a coincidence of geometry. The chain creates space and restricts the opponent's pieces on that side, which naturally concentrates force there. The side whose pawns point toward the opponent's king has a structural arrow telling them where to push. A pawn majority on one wing functions in a related but distinct manner. A majority gives you more pawns than your opponent has on that side of the board, which is a space advantage in that region. However, space only becomes an attack when the structure also provides a way to open files and bring pieces into the action. Advancing majority pawns to gain ground is the first step. The second step, the one that actually creates danger, is the pawn exchange that opens a file and lets your rooks in. One without the other is incomplete. The principle appears in writing on Middlegame planning, including Kotoff's work, that the correct approach is to evaluate the pawn structure before calculating any concrete lines. That sequence matters. If you start calculating attacks without first reading what the structure supports, you can spend a lot of moves pursuing a plan the position never actually offered you. The base of a pawn chain is worth paying attention to from the defensive side. The base is the pawn at the back of the chain, the one that cannot be protected by the pawns in front of it. It is the most exposed point in the chain, and a well-placed opponent will target it. Defending the base often becomes a structural responsibility that shapes where your pieces need to be, not because you chose to put them there, but because the structure demands it. The confusion that comes up most often at the intermediate level is between having space and having an attacking line. A player gains space, feels like they are doing well, and starts looking for an attack, but the structure has not actually opened any corridors. The pieces have nowhere to go. Space is useful because it restricts the opponent and gives your pieces room to maneuver, but it only becomes an attack when the pawn formation provides a clear avenue toward the opponent's position. If that avenue is not there, the plan is not there either. Reading the structure first is what allows you to identify the correct direction before moving anything. The structure is the map, guiding your attack. Once you know where the action belongs, the structure tells you something else, which pieces belong in this position, and what they should be doing. This is one of the more concrete ways pawn structure governs the middle game. The formation assigns roles. It determines which pieces are active and which are passive, and it identifies which squares serve as long-term homes for specific pieces. Knights depend on outpost squares. A knight sitting on a stable square deep in the opponent's position, supported by pawns and not easily challenged by enemy pawns, is a powerful piece. But that outpost has to exist in the structure. If the pawn formation does not provide a stable square, the knight has no anchor. It can move around, but it will not have the kind of lasting influence that an outposted knight generates. When the structure does provide that square, the knight becomes one of the most influential pieces in the position, and building a plan around its influence is often the right idea. Bishops work differently. A bishop needs open diagonals. The pawn formation either grants those diagonals or blocks them. When a bishop's own pawns are fixed on the same color squares as the bishop, those pawns are sitting directly in its path. The bishop cannot pass through its own pawns. It gets pushed to the edges of the board, or stuck behind the pawn wall, contributing almost nothing to the position. This is what a bad bishop is. Not a bishop that has made a mistake, but a bishop that the structure has rendered passive. The pawns are fixed, the diagonals are closed, and the bishop's value has been significantly degraded by the formation itself. Nimzovich's idea of overprotection connects here. Key central squares, often the ones highlighted by the pawn structure, can be worth guarding with more pieces than strictly necessary. The structure identifies which squares matter most, and overprotecting them prevents the opponent from ever using those squares as entry points. It is a structural reading translated directly into piece placement. Silman frames it as an imbalance to evaluate. The pawn structure is one of the key factors a player should assess when deciding where pieces belong. It sits alongside open files and piece activity as a guide for placement and planning. The point is that piece placement is not a separate question from pawn structure. They are the same question asked from two different angles. Strategic plans derive from the same source. A minority attack, where the side with fewer pawns on one wing advances them to create structural weaknesses in the opponent's majority, only makes sense when the pawn formation supports it. The plan is not invented from preference. It is read out of the structure. In the Carlsbad formation, for example, the logic of advancing the b-pawn to break up the opponent's queenside pawns comes directly from the way the pawns are arranged. The defender in that same structure coordinates pieces to reinforce the weaknesses the attack is trying to create, again because the structure defines where the pressure will land. Pawn breaks are guided by the structure. A break is a pawn advance designed to open lines and change the character of the position. The right break is the one the structure is pointing toward. In the Botvinnik system, characterized by pawns on c4, d3, and e4, alongside a fianchettoed bishop on g2, the thematic break is f4 to f5, aimed at generating kingside pressure and opening lines toward the opponent's position. That break does not come from nowhere. The pawn formation was always pointing that direction. Piece regroupings are similarly directed by the structure. When a piece needs to move to a better square, the better square is almost always the one the structure has identified as important. A knight heading toward a central outpost, a rook shifting to an open file, a bishop being rerouted to a more active diagonal. These decisions are not guesses. They follow from reading what the structure needs. The mismatch problem is worth naming directly. When a player's pieces are poorly coordinated with their own pawn structure, the position drifts. There is no clear plan because the pieces are not aligned with what the formation is asking for. This is one of the most common sources of strategic confusion at the intermediate level. The pieces are not bad in isolation. They are just mismatched to the structure they are sitting in. Fixing that mismatch by rerouting pieces to squares the structure actually supports is often the clearest path to a coherent plan. Structure does more than suggest a plan. It often defines one. The player who reads the formation accurately and places pieces accordingly is not making creative decisions in a vacuum. They are responding to the inherent logic of the position. Chapter 6. Pawn structures in the endgame. In the middle game, pawn structure shapes the game from the background. It sets the available plans, determines which pieces are well placed, and creates the targets both sides work toward. But pieces are still on the board, and pieces can compensate for a lot. An active rook can neutralize a weak pawn. A well-placed knight can offset a structural hole. The middle game gives you resources to work with, and those resources can paper over structural problems long enough to find counterplay or reach a better position. The endgame removes that cover. When queens come off and the minor pieces thin out, the pawn structure stops being background scaffolding and becomes the primary thing you are evaluating. Weaknesses that were manageable under the protection of active pieces become exposed. Advantages that were abstract, a slightly better majority here, a more compact formation there, become concrete and often decisive. The structure that was quietly shaping the game all along now steps into the foreground and starts determining the outcome directly. That shift is worth sitting with for a moment. The same pawn formation that existed in the middle game is often still on the board when the endgame begins. Nothing structurally dramatic has changed. What has changed is that there are fewer resources available to compensate for its liabilities, or to delay its strengths from converting. The endgame is where structural precision gets rewarded, and structural carelessness gets punished, more clearly than anywhere else in the game. The most important structural feature in the endgame is the passed pawn. Its promotion threat transforms it from a long-term asset into the central object of both sides' plans. In the middle game, a passed pawn is a long-term asset. In the endgame, it becomes the central object of both sides' plans, because it carries the threat of promotion. A pawn that reaches the back rank becomes a queen, and that transformation is not a distant possibility. It is a concrete winning condition that the defending side must actively prevent. The promotion potential of a passed pawn depends on several factors, and not all passed pawns are equally dangerous. The file the pawn sits on matters more than most people expect. A pawn on a central file, the D or E file, tends to be more dangerous than one on the edge of the board. A rook pawn, a pawn on the A or H file, often has reduced promotion potential because the defending king can reach the corner relatively easily and set up a drawing fortress. The geometry of the board works in the defender's favor on the edge, in a way it does not in the center. Table bases confirm that positions that look structurally similar can have completely different outcomes, depending purely on which file the passed pawn occupies. Distance matters too. A passed pawn that is far from the opposing king is far more threatening than one the king can easily blockade. This is the logic behind the outside passed pawn, which forces the opposing king away from the main pawn structure to deal with it. When the defending king has to chase a pawn on one side of the board, the attacking king can advance freely on the other side. The outside passed pawn acts as a decoy, and the real winning plan unfolds while the defender is occupied. Connected passed pawns are even more powerful. A single passed pawn can be blockaded by a king or a piece. Two connected passed pawns are much harder to stop, because they can support each other's advance. Connected passed pawns are generally considered far more difficult to stop than a single passed pawn, even when everything else on the board is equal. The reason is straightforward. The defender cannot blockade both pawns simultaneously with a single piece. It is also worth correcting a common assumption here. Having more pawns does not automatically mean you are winning in the endgame. Pawn quality and structure matter more than raw count. A player with 4 pawns that are scattered across the board in separate islands, unable to support each other or generate a passed pawn, can easily lose to a player with 3 pawns that are well connected and capable of advancing together. The question is not how many pawns you have. The question is what those pawns can do. One structural detail that endgame theory pays close attention to is self-blocking. In 2-pawn versus 1-pawn endings, the stronger side only wins reliably if its pawn structure avoids getting in its own way. If the leading pawn obstructs the supporting pawn's ability to advance or assist, the advantage dissolves. The pawns need to work together, and their relative placement on the board determines whether they do. There is also the question of under-promotion, which comes up in endgame studies and occasionally in practical play. Promoting to a queen is the right choice in the vast majority of cases, but specific pawn and king geometries occasionally make promotion to a knight the only winning move. A knight can cover squares a queen cannot reach in certain configurations, and if the queen promotion would result in stalemate or allow an immediate fork, the knight becomes the correct piece. These situations are rare, but they are a reminder that promotion potential is not just about reaching the back rank. It is about what the promoted piece can do from there. Now, the moment when all of this becomes practically relevant is the transition from middle game to endgame. This transition is often triggered by a queen exchange or a significant reduction in material, and it is the moment when structural liabilities that were manageable suddenly become decisive. A backward pawn sitting on an open file was a problem in the middle game, but a rook could defend it, and an active piece could create enough counterplay to keep the game complicated. Once those pieces are gone, the pawn just sits there as a permanent target. The opposing rook lands on the open file, the king marches toward it, and there is nothing left to generate counterplay with. Doubled pawns follow the same pattern. In the middle game, doubled pawns can sometimes be tolerated because they open a file, improve piece activity, or create other compensating factors. In the endgame, the compensation often disappears while the structural liability remains. Two pawns on the same file cannot both advance. They cannot generate a passed pawn from that structure without help. And the side with the healthier pawn majority can simply advance on the wing, where they have the structural advantage. Pawn islands matter more in the endgame for the same reason. Each separate group requires its own defensive resources. In the middle game, pieces can cover multiple weaknesses simultaneously. In the endgame, the king can only be in one place, and a position with 3 pawn islands is much harder to defend than one with a single connected majority. The habit to build is this: before simplifying into an endgame, evaluate your pawn structure as if you are seeing it for the first time. Consider whether your pawns can support a king march. Determine if your majority can generate a passed pawn, and if that pawn will be on a file where promotion is actually achievable. Check if any of your pawns are sitting on open files where they will become immediate targets once the major pieces come off. Reflect on whether your structure has pawn islands that will require defensive resources you will not have. This is the same structural reading that has been relevant throughout the earlier phases of the game. The difference is that in the endgame, the evaluation is no longer about which plans are available or which pieces are well placed. It is about whether the structure can convert an advantage into a win or hold a disadvantage to a draw. The stakes of getting the reading right are higher because there is nothing left to fall back on. A player who enters an endgame with a structurally sound majority, connected pawns capable of generating a passed pawn on a good file, and no chronic weaknesses on open files, has a concrete technical task ahead of them. A player who enters with scattered islands, a backward pawn on an open file, and a majority that cannot advance without self-blocking, has a defensive problem that will only grow harder as the position simplifies further. The structure's significance is undeniable, and the endgame is where that truth becomes the focal point of the battle. Chapter 7: Common Pawn Structures and Their Characteristics. Instead of asking when a feature matters, you ask what kind of formation you are looking at. Naming the structure comes first. Everything else follows from that recognition. Certain pawn formations appear again and again across thousands of games. They show up in completely different openings, with completely different pieces on the board, and yet they carry the same recognizable properties every time. The isolated pawn behaves like an isolated pawn, whether the position arose from a queen's gambit or a French defense. A pawn chain pointing toward the king side creates the same spatial pressure regardless of what minor pieces are behind it. These formations are not abstractions. They are concrete, identifiable objects on the board, and learning to spot them quickly is what allows the planning principles from earlier chapters to actually connect to a real position. The three formations worth understanding first are the isolated pawn, the pawn chain, and the pawn majority. Each one has a clear definition, a set of structural properties that follow directly from that definition, and a tension between strength and weakness built into its nature. The isolated pawn is the simplest to define. A pawn is isolated when there are no pawns of the same color on either of the two adjacent files. It does not matter what rank the pawn is on. What matters is that the files immediately to its left and right are empty of friendly pawns. That single structural fact has consequences that ripple outward. Without a neighbor on either side, the isolated pawn cannot be defended by another pawn. It must rely entirely on pieces for protection. And because the files beside it are clear of friendly pawns, those files tend to be open or semi-open, which means the pawn sits in territory that enemy rooks and queens can reach without obstruction. The definition is consistent with how instructional writers on positional chess, including Jeremy Silman, have framed it. No fellow pawns on adjacent files to help defend it. That definition is simple, but it captures the structural reality precisely. The pawn chain is a different kind of formation. Where the isolated pawn is defined by absence, the pawn chain is defined by connection. A pawn chain is a diagonal sequence of same-colored pawns, where each pawn, except the one at the rear, is protected by the pawn directly behind it on the adjacent file. The chain runs diagonally forward, with each supporting pawn one rank closer to its own side of the board than the pawn it protects. You need at least two pawns connected this way for the formation to qualify as a chain, though in practice chains of 3 or 4 pawns are common. Two specific points in the chain carry distinct structural weight. The base is the rearmost pawn, the one that has no pawn behind it, providing support. The tip is the foremost pawn, the one at the leading edge of the chain that does not protect any other pawn in the formation. These two ends of the chain are structurally different in ways that matter for how both sides should think about attacking or defending the formation. The pawn majority is the third formation, and it is defined by counting, rather than by the shape of the pawns themselves. A pawn majority exists when one side has more pawns than the opponent on a specific sector of the board, typically the king side, queen side, or center. The comparison is made across a contiguous group of files, usually 3 or 4, and what matters is the numerical difference. 3 pawns against 2 on the queen side is a majority. 2 against 1 on the king side is a majority. The count alone does not tell you everything, but it is the starting point for evaluating what that wing can produce. Now take each of these formations and examine what its structural properties actually mean in practice. The isolated pawn presents a dynamic balance. On one side of that balance is activity. Because the files adjacent to the isolated pawn are clear of friendly pawns, lines open up. Rooks can use those files. The isolated pawn itself, particularly when it sits on a central file like D or E, controls squares in front of it that become difficult for the opponent to occupy safely. An isolated D-pawn, for example, controls E5 and C5, and those squares can become outposts for knights or active squares for bishops. The pawn's presence discourages certain enemy pawn advances and keeps lines open in ways that generate piece activity across the board. On the other side of that balance is the weakness. The pawn cannot be defended by another pawn for as long as those adjacent files remain clear. That is a durable structural fact, one that persists unless the position changes through exchange or advance. It must be protected by pieces, which means pieces are partially committed to a defensive task rather than operating freely. The file in front of the isolated pawn is typically open or semi-open, giving the opponent a natural avenue to bring rooks and queens directly to bear on it. Enemy pieces can also be placed directly in front of the pawn, blockading it and preventing it from advancing. A blockading piece on the square directly in front of an isolated pawn is particularly effective because the pawn cannot threaten it, and the pawn's own advance is stopped. Minor pieces that find stable squares around the pawn, squares the pawn cannot contest because its neighbors are absent, add further pressure. The key insight is that these are not two separate evaluations. They are two faces of the same structural fact. The open files and active squares exist because the adjacent files are empty of friendly pawns. The vulnerability exists for exactly the same reason. Whether the isolated pawn is an asset or a liability depends on what the position demands, specifically whether the dynamic piece activity it enables outweighs the long-term cost of defending a pawn that pieces must protect indefinitely. The pawn chain demonstrates a distinct structural interplay. The chain controls space on the side toward which it points. Each pawn in the chain protects a square diagonally ahead of it, and the cumulative effect is a wedge of controlled territory that restricts the opponent's piece mobility on that side of the board. Pieces that try to operate on the squares in front of the chain run into pawn control at every step. The chain effectively defines a boundary, and the side that owns the chain has a natural sector for piece deployment. But the chain's strength and its liability are inseparable. The base pawn is the structural anchor of the entire formation. If the base is captured, the pawn that was resting on it loses its support, and the mutual protection structure of the chain begins to unravel. The base is the pawn whose loss causes the most damage to the chain's integrity, which makes it a natural target for the opposing side. The tip pawn, at the leading edge of the chain, is more exposed to direct attack because it sits closest to the opponent's position. However, losing the tip is less structurally damaging than losing the base. The tip can be captured without collapsing the chain's underlying support structure. This asymmetry between base and tip is one of the more precise structural distinctions in chess, and recognizing it immediately tells you where to focus attention when either attacking or defending a chain. The pawn majority's defining property is its potential to generate a passed pawn. A numerical advantage on one wing means the side with more pawns can, in principle, advance those pawns and force the creation of a passer that the opponent cannot match. 3 pawns against 2, advanced in coordination, will eventually produce a pawn with no opposing pawn to stop it. That passed pawn then becomes a concrete winning resource, particularly in the endgame, where its value was established in the previous chapter. The word healthy matters here. A healthy majority is one whose pawns are not doubled, isolated, or backward within that sector. Healthy pawns can advance together without creating new weaknesses, and their advance can be supported by pieces without leaving undefended gaps behind. A compromised majority is a different situation entirely. If the pawns in the majority are fragmented into separate islands, or if one of them is already backward or doubled, their ability to advance in coordination is impaired. The numerical advantage exists on paper, but may not translate into a passed pawn in practice. Counting the pawns on a wing tells you whether a majority exists. Assessing the health of those pawns tells you whether it can be used. Recognizing these 3 formations by name and by their structural properties is not a small thing. It is the step that connects abstract principles about pawn structure to the specific position in front of you. When you see an isolated pawn, you already know the relevant tension without having to work it out from scratch. When you see a pawn chain, you know where to look for the base and what its loss would mean. When you see a majority, you know the first question to ask is whether it is healthy enough to advance. The name carries the structure, and the structure carries the plan. Chapter 8. Strategies for utilizing different pawn structures. Recognizing a structure by name is only half the work. The other half is knowing what to do once you have made that identification. Each structural type carries a built-in logic, and that logic points towards specific plans, specific piece placements, and specific targets. The goal here is to make that connection feel automatic. Each structural type carries a built-in logic, and that logic points towards specific plans, specific piece placements, and specific targets. The goal here is to make that connection feel automatic. Start with the isolated queen's pawn. The side holding it has a pawn on d4, with no friendly pawns on the core, or e-files to support it. In simplified positions, that isolation is a liability, but in the middle game the structure offers real compensation. The pawn controls e5 and c5, two squares that enemy pieces cannot easily occupy without being challenged. Those squares become natural homes for knights and bishops. The rooks belong on the car and e-files, which are half open precisely because no pawns block them. From there, pressure builds naturally toward the center and toward the opponent's king. The primary dynamic plan with an isolated queen's pawn is the d4 to d5 advance. When the moment is right, pushing that pawn forward opens lines, displaces enemy pieces, and converts the pawn's central energy into direct attacking activity. The pawn is not meant to sit and be defended indefinitely. It is meant to move at the right moment and create chaos. That is why keeping pieces on the board matters so much in these positions. Exchanges simplify the game and expose the isolated pawn as a static weakness. Complexity is the IQP owner's friend. The opponent's strategy runs in exactly the opposite direction. The goal is to place a piece on d5, ideally a knight, to blockade the pawn and neutralize its advance. Once the pawn is fixed and unable to push forward, it stops being dynamic and starts being a target. The defending side then regroups to attack it with rooks and queens along the d-file. Every exchange the defender can force brings the position closer to an endgame, where the isolated pawn is simply a weakness with no compensation attached. Pawn chains work differently. A pawn chain is a diagonal formation where each pawn protects the one ahead of it, with the rearmest pawn, the base, having no pawn behind it to offer the same support. The head of the chain points toward a sector of the board, and that direction tells the side holding the chain where to focus activity. If the chain points toward the king side, piece play and pawn breaks in that sector are the natural plan. The chain creates space on one side and restricts the opponent's pieces on that same side, so the holder presses the advantage there with rooks, queens, and supporting pawn advances. The opponent's task is not to attack the head of the chain, which is the most protected pawn in the formation. The target is the base. The base pawn has no friendly pawn behind it to support it. If it falls, or if pressure on it forces the chain to become rigid and passive, the whole formation weakens. The attacking side places rooks and queens on files, leading to the base, builds pressure over several moves, and looks for pawn breaks that undermine it directly. Capturing the base does not just win a pawn. It can destabilize every pawn in the chain above it. The side holding the chain defends by maintaining its integrity with timely pawn moves and piece support, while simultaneously preparing the attack that the chain's direction points toward. The chain is both a defensive structure and a launching pad. The key is not to let the base become a chronic weakness while advancing on the other side of the board. Pawn majorities present a different kind of strategic question. A healthy majority on one wing means more pawns than the opponent has in that sector, with no structural defects that would prevent them from advancing. The primary objective is to create a passed pawn by coordinating the advance of those pawns in a controlled, supported sequence. That passed pawn then becomes a long-term asset, either forcing the opponent to tie pieces down to stop it, or eventually converting into a promotion threat. A secondary benefit of advancing a majority is space. Pushing pawns forward on one wing restricts the opponent's pieces in that sector, improves the activity of your own pieces there, and opens files for rooks to operate on. These benefits often arrive before a passed pawn is even created. The majority gains value just by advancing, even if it takes many moves to produce a passer. The important discipline with a majority is coordination. Pushing pawns recklessly without piece support can leave them overextended or create new weaknesses. The pawns advance together, with nearby pieces ready to support them and exploit the space they gain. The opponent on the minority side may try a minority attack, using fewer pawns to create structural damage in the majority formation, turning what looks like a strength into an isolated or backward pawn. The majority owner needs to watch for this and advance with enough control to prevent it. Backward pawns on half-open files generate their own structural logic. The pawn cannot be defended by another pawn, and the file in front of it is open for the opponent's rooks. That combination makes the backward pawn a natural target. The attacking side doubles rooks on the half-open file, occupies adjacent squares to control entry points, and applies sustained pressure. The goal is not necessarily to win the pawn immediately, but to force the defending side to commit pieces to its defense, restricting their activity everywhere else. The defending side has two main responses. The first is to cluster pieces around the pawn and hold it. The second is to find a timely pawn break that either advances the backward pawn to a safer square or releases the tension in a way that trades the weakness for activity. Moving the pawn prematurely without preparation is a common mistake. If the advance creates new weaknesses or loses material, the defending side has traded one problem for another without improving the position. The break has to be prepared carefully, and until it is ready, the defending side plays actively in other parts of the board to compensate. What connects all of these structures is that the plan comes from the position, not from habit. This is one of the clearest markers of a player who is developing structurally versus one whose results have plateaued. A player who has a preferred attacking style and applies it regardless of structure will eventually find themselves pushing pieces toward a sector where their own pawns provide no support, no space, and no useful breaks. The pieces end up misplaced, the attack stalls, and the structural weaknesses they ignored become long-term problems. The practical discipline is to read the structure before selecting a plan. Examine which files are open or half-open, and determine which side benefits from them. Identify which side of the board the pawn formation favors, and direct operations there. Assess whether the pawn breaks you are considering are actually available given the current formation, or whether your pieces would need to be somewhere else entirely to make them work. If the plan you want to play requires piece placements that your own pawns are blocking, that is a signal to revise the plan rather than force it through. Pawn structure narrows the field of viable plans for both sides simultaneously. This is not a limitation on creativity. It is information. Knowing that the structure rules out certain plans means you can focus your thinking on the ones that actually work. The player who interprets the formation accurately and builds a plan from what it offers will consistently find better moves than the player who imports a preferred scheme from memory and tries to make the position fit it. Structure does not offer a single correct plan in most positions. It offers a range of plans that are compatible with the formation and rules out a larger range that are not. The skill is in identifying that compatible range quickly and choosing the most energetic option within it. That habit of asking what the structure supports before committing to a direction is what structural awareness actually looks like in practice. Chapter 9. Transitioning between pawn structures. Pawn structures are often taught as stable things. You learn the isolated pawn, the pawn chain, the pawn majority, and you learn the plans that go with each one. That knowledge is real, and it matters. Yet, in actual games, structures are dynamic. They shift. Sometimes deliberately, sometimes under pressure, and sometimes because one pawn capture quietly changes everything about the position. Learning to recognize those moments, and to navigate them with intention, is its own skill. A structural transition is not just any pawn move. Plenty of pawn moves adjust space or improve square control without changing the fundamental character of the position. What makes a transition genuinely structural is when the formation crosses into a different type entirely. A closed center that cracks open after a central pawn exchange is a different world from the one that existed a move earlier. An isolated pawn that appears after a specific capture introduces a new set of problems and possibilities that simply were not present before. A pawn chain that loses its base and dissolves changes the entire geometry of the position. These are changes in kind, not just degree. The triggers for these transitions are fairly consistent. Pawn captures that alter which files are open or half open are the most common cause. When central pawns are exchanged, lines that were closed suddenly become active, and long-range pieces that had no scope can now operate freely. Pawn breaks, where a pawn advances to challenge or displace a key opposing pawn, are another primary trigger. A well-timed break can convert a locked, maneuvering game into one with open files and direct attacking possibilities almost instantly. Piece pressure can also force structural change indirectly. When an attack compels a pawn to advance or capture in a way the defending player did not choose, the resulting structure may be quite different from what either side was planning. In those cases, the transition is not initiated so much as it is imposed. One thing worth understanding clearly is that structural transitions are not always dramatic. The moment of change is often a single pawn capture, and the full consequences of that capture may take several moves to become visible. The position does not announce that it has changed type. The open file appears. The weak square becomes accessible. The bishop that was blocked suddenly has a long diagonal, and gradually the strategic demands of the position are completely different from what they were before. Intermediate players often lose their bearings at this point, continuing to apply plans that suited the previous structure without recognizing that the formation has fundamentally changed beneath them. This is why anticipation generally serves you better than reaction. Reacting to a completed structural transition means adapting piece placement and plans to a new configuration after the fact. Anticipating one means evaluating the likely pawn breaks and captures before they occur, assessing what weak squares, open files, and outposts will appear, and deciding in advance whether to allow the change, accelerate it, or prevent it. Players who anticipate structural transitions develop their pieces with the expected future formation in mind, not just the current one. Rooks are placed near files that are about to open. Bishops are positioned along diagonals that a pawn break will clear, and central tension is maintained until preparation is complete. That kind of forward-looking structural awareness is what separates purposeful play from reactive play. The decision to initiate or allow a structural transition carries real strategic weight, because the resulting formation will impose new constraints and opportunities on both sides simultaneously. This is not a one-sided calculation. When a structure shifts, both players experience changes in their weak squares, their piece activity, and the viability of their existing plans. A transition that opens the center benefits long-range pieces for both sides, but the degree of benefit depends entirely on where each player's pieces already are. The side whose rooks are already near the files that open, whose bishops already aim at the diagonals that clear, gains far more than the side that has to scramble to reposition. The concept of structural commitment sharpens the stakes here. Because no future pawn move can undo an advance or capture, every transition locks in a new set of positional realities. Creating an isolated pawn through a transition is a lasting consequence. Opening the king's position through a pawn break cannot be undone by later play. This irreversibility raises the stakes considerably. A structural transition that produces a temporary shift in piece activity is a relatively lower risk decision, because even if the resulting position proves difficult, there is room to adapt. A transition that creates new permanent weaknesses, doubled pawns, isolated pawns, a compromised king shelter, demands a much higher level of confidence before it is executed. Piece imbalances should directly influence the decision. If you have the bishop pair, transitions that open the position increase the bishop's scope and mobility. If you have a knight against a bishop, maintaining a more closed structure works in your favor, because the knight's short-range mobility is less penalized by locked pawns. When one side has rooks better placed for file play, transitions that open files are worth pursuing. When the rooks are poorly coordinated, opening files prematurely hands the opponent the activity you were hoping to gain. These piece-based filters are a practical first step in evaluating whether a given transition is worth pursuing at all. The most important preparation principle is this: the transition should be executed after the pieces are already positioned to benefit from it, not before. Adequate preparation means placing rooks on or near the files expected to open, aligning bishops and queens with the diagonals that a pawn break will clear, and ensuring that no key pieces remain undeveloped or badly placed when the structural change occurs. Initiating a break while pieces are still poorly coordinated leaves you unable to exploit the resulting open lines, and the opponent, if better prepared, will benefit more from the new structure than you will. The common error is initiating a structural transition for purely tactical reasons, because it wins a pawn, or forces a temporary initiative, or solves an immediate problem, without evaluating what the resulting formation actually looks like. A pawn break that opens files to win material, but leaves the king structurally exposed, is a transaction with hidden costs. Creating an isolated pawn during a combination without assessing how it will be defended in the long-term structure is a mistake that may not become visible for many moves. Transforming a solid formation into one with multiple pawn islands, just to generate short-term pressure, often trades a durable advantage for a temporary one. The discipline required is straightforward to describe, even if it takes practice to apply. Before executing a structural transition, compare your piece placement to the expected new formation. Consider whether your pieces naturally aim at the area of the board that becomes important after the change. Evaluate if the resulting pawn structure complements your piece types. Determine if the weaknesses the transition creates are permanent or manageable. Finally, assess whether your opponent's pieces are better suited to the new structure than yours are. If the answers favor you, the transition is worth pursuing. If they do not, the structure you have may be worth preserving, even under pressure to change it. Structures are not states to be settled into indefinitely. They are processes, and the moments when they change are among the most consequential decisions in a game. Recognizing when a transition is approaching, understanding what it will produce, and having your pieces already pointed at the resulting formation before you pull the trigger. That sequence of thinking is what turns structural knowledge from something passive into something active. Chapter 10. Mistakes to avoid with pawn structures. Pawn structure knowledge only helps if it actually changes how you make decisions at the board. Knowing that isolated pawns are weak, or that weak squares invite outposts, is not the same as avoiding the errors that create those problems in the first place. This chapter is about the gap between understanding and execution, specifically the recurring patterns where that gap shows up most often. The root of most structural mistakes is not ignorance of the rules. It is a disconnect between pawn moves and piece coordination. A player advances or exchanges a pawn to solve an immediate problem, or simply because it looks active, without asking what the resulting formation will look like, and whether the pieces on the board can actually work within it. That disconnect is where structural damage begins. The first and most common error is treating pawn moves as low stakes. Because pawns are worth less than any other piece, there is a natural tendency to move them casually, as if they are preparatory filler before the real decisions begin. But a pawn move is permanent. It cannot be undone. Every advance fixes a set of positional relationships that will persist for the rest of the game. The squares a pawn leaves behind, the diagonals it opens or closes, the files it creates or seals, all of that is now part of the position's character. Moving a pawn without fully accounting for those consequences is not a minor slip. It is a structural commitment made without foresight. Closely related is the mistake of creating a structural concession without a compensating idea. An isolated pawn is not inherently losing. A backward pawn is not automatically fatal. What makes these formations dangerous is creating them without a concrete reason. When a player accepts an isolated pawn in exchange for active piece play, open files, and pressure on the opponent's position, the concession is justified. When the same structure arises because a pawn exchange was made reflexively, without calculating what the resulting formation demands, the same weakness now exists without the compensation. The imbalance is identical. The difference is whether there is a plan attached to it. This is worth pausing on, because improving players often know the names of structural weaknesses, but still create them carelessly. The problem is not lack of vocabulary. It is the habit of evaluating each pawn move in isolation, rather than asking what the whole formation will look like afterward, and whether that formation serves the pieces already on the board. Unnecessary pawn advances are a particularly common form of this error. Pushing a pawn to gain space feels active. It looks like progress. But a pawn advance weakens the squares it leaves behind, and if those squares are near the king, the consequences can be severe. Advancing the pawns that previously controlled the squares around your king can give the opponent a lasting outpost and long-term attacking prospects that are very difficult to neutralize. Once advanced, the pawn cannot return, leaving behind vulnerable squares. A related mistake is overextending pawns to claim space without first confirming that the pieces can support and defend the advanced structure. Space is only an advantage when it can be maintained. Pawns pushed forward without coordinated piece development become targets. The opponent does not need to break through immediately. They can simply maneuver against the overextended pawns, forcing defensive concessions that gradually unravel the position. Flank pawn advances made before central control is established represent another version of this error. Pushing pawns on the wings, while the center remains unresolved, is structurally backwards. The center governs the whole board. A player who neglects it in favor of wing activity often finds that the opponent's central pawns become a lever that cracks the entire position open at the moment it is least convenient. Careless pawn breaks fall into the same category. A pawn break is a structural decision with consequences that extend well beyond the immediate move. When a break is executed without calculating the resulting exchanges, it can open files and diagonals that benefit the opponent's pieces rather than your own. The position changes unfavorably, and this is especially damaging because a structural transition, once triggered, cannot be reversed. One of the more subtle errors involves bishops and pawn color. When a player builds a pawn structure on the same color squares as their own bishop, that bishop's scope is permanently reduced. The pawns block the diagonals the bishop needs to be useful. This often happens gradually, through a series of individually reasonable-looking moves, until the bishop is completely hemmed in by its own pawns. Recognizing this pattern requires evaluating the color complex before committing to a pawn advance, not after the bishop is already restricted. Similarly, closing the position with pawn chains can be a mistake when it restricts your own bishops more than the opponent's. If the opponent has a knight and you have a bishop, locking the position generally favors them. If the opponent has the bishop pair and you are closing the center to neutralize it, that is a different calculation. The error is not closing the position in principle. It is closing it without first asking which pieces benefit from the resulting structure. Doubled pawns created by careless capture decisions are another recognizable pattern. When a capture on a given file is available, there is often a choice of which pawn to use. Capturing with the wrong pawn can create a doubled pawn weakness that is difficult or impossible to repair. The alternative capture might have maintained a connected, mobile structure. The position after the capture looks similar in material, but the structural consequences can be entirely different. All of these errors share a common feature. They arise from not asking the right question before moving. The corrective habit is straightforward to describe, even if it takes consistent practice to build. Before any pawn move, pause and evaluate which squares the move permanently weakens. That evaluation is not optional. It is the structural equivalent of checking whether a piece move hangs something. Skipping it is how structural damage accumulates. A second concrete habit is to classify the position before committing to a pawn decision. Is the center open or closed? Is it locked or still in tension? That classification tells you whether to advance, exchange, or hold. A pawn break that makes sense in an open position can be a serious mistake in a closed one, and vice versa. Knowing which type of position you are in is the prerequisite for knowing what the structure is asking for. Piece placement and pawn structure must be planned together. Before executing a pawn advance, confirm that the resulting structure supports the pieces already on the board. If you have a dark squared bishop and the advance will close the dark squared diagonal permanently, that is a reason to reconsider. If you have rooks that need open files and the advance will lock the center, the timing matters. The pieces and the pawns are not separate problems. They are one problem. Pawn breaks should only be executed when enough pieces are already developed to occupy the lines that will open. An early break that opens files before your rooks are active simply hands the opponent the initiative on those lines. The break itself might be structurally correct, but mistimed, it becomes a strategic error. Around the king, the habit of tracking which color complex your pawns are weakening is particularly important. Once you have advanced a pawn that previously guarded a set of squares near your king, every additional pawn move that weakens the same color complex compounds the problem. The first advance might be manageable. The second or third makes the weakness chronic. Noticing the pattern early before it becomes a cluster of weak squares, is how king's safety errors are prevented, rather than repaired. The most effective general corrective is simply slowing down at structural decision points. Pawn moves are often treated as automatic, as if they are just setting up the position for the pieces to do the real work. That instinct is the source of most structural errors. A pawn move is not preparation for a decision. It is a decision. Treating it as one, by pausing, evaluating the resulting formation, and confirming that the structure serves the pieces and the plan, is the habit that separates players who accumulate structural weaknesses from those who do not. The essence of this chapter is about cultivating the habit of deliberate evaluation before committing to pawn moves. By doing so, players can avoid the pitfalls of structural errors and maintain a cohesive strategy throughout the game. Chapter 11. Mastering Pawn Structures. The Path to Improvement. At this point, you have covered a significant amount of ground. You understand that pawn moves are irreversible. You know how structure shapes piece activity, determines which plans are viable, and sets the conditions for both the middle game and the end game. You have seen how structural errors compound over time, and you have practiced the habit of pausing at structural decision points before committing to a move. That body of knowledge is real, and it is worth taking a moment to understand what it actually gives you going forward. The most important thing it gives you is a lens. Not a checklist, not a set of rules to apply mechanically, but a way of reading any position you encounter. When you sit down at the board, the pawn formation is already telling you something before a single piece moves. It is telling you which side of the board is likely to become active, which squares are permanently weak, which pieces will thrive and which will struggle, and what kind of plans are structurally supported versus structurally contradicted. That reading does not require you to have memorized every formation you have ever studied. It requires you to have internalized the habit of asking the right questions. Aaron Nimzovich, whose work on positional chess remains foundational, devoted enormous attention to exactly this kind of structural thinking. His argument was that understanding typical pawn formations and the plans they generate is central to middle game improvement in a way that purely tactical training is not. The distinction he was drawing is still relevant. Tactical skill is primarily calculation-based. You see a sequence, you work it out, you execute it. Positional understanding is evaluation-based. You look at a formation and derive a direction. Both matter, but they develop differently, and structural understanding is the one that tends to be underestimated by players who are still improving. The reason it gets underestimated is that it looks less concrete than tactics. A fork or a pin has an immediate, visible payoff. A decision to keep your pawn structure flexible, rather than overextend, might not show its value for another 15 or 20 moves. That delay makes it easy to treat structural considerations as secondary, something to think about when there is nothing tactical happening. But this perspective has it backwards. The structure is always happening. Every position has a pawn formation, and that formation is always shaping what is possible. The question is only whether you are reading it consciously, or letting it influence you without your awareness. What changes when structural thinking becomes a genuine habit is the quality of your decision-making at the moments that matter most. Instructional materials consistently describe this shift in concrete terms. Players who have internalized structural evaluation begin to reject moves that create permanent weaknesses, not because they have calculated out every consequence, but because the structural signal is clear enough that the move feels wrong before the calculation even begins. They begin to prioritize plans that improve pawn cohesion and space control over immediate but superficial piece activity. They start asking where the structure wants the pieces to go, rather than placing pieces, and then hoping the structure cooperates. This is the difference between reactive play and purposeful play, and it is a difference that structural understanding creates directly. Philidor's claim that pawns are the soul of chess was not a metaphor about importance in the abstract. It was a practical observation about where the game's character is actually determined. The pawn formation is the part of the position that persists. Pieces come and go, trades happen, tactics resolve, but the structural skeleton remains and continues to define the strategic reality of the position throughout. Once you understand that, you stop treating pawn moves as low-stakes filler between piece maneuvers and start treating them as the primary decisions they actually are. This shift in priority is not a talent. It is a trained habit of attention. Players sometimes assume that strong positional players have an intuition they were born with, some natural feel for structure that others simply lack. What they actually have is a pattern of evaluation they have applied consistently across many games until it became automatic. The structural intuition that looks effortless in a strong player was built the same way any skill is built, through repeated, attentive application until the conscious effort fades into background habit. Which brings us to what comes next for you, and the straightforward answer is that there is no endpoint here. Mastery of pawn structures is not a level you reach and then maintain. It is a relationship with the game that deepens the more positions you encounter. The concepts you have built across this study will appear again and again in your games, but they will appear in new combinations, under new pressures, in positions you have not seen before. Each of those encounters is not a test of whether you remember what you learned. It is an opportunity to confirm and extend what you already understand. The practical implication of that is straightforward. The formations you encounter most often in your own games, the ones that arise from the openings you actually play, are the ones where your structural recognition will develop fastest. Repeated exposure to the same pawn skeletons accelerates the internalization of the plans associated with them. Players who regularly face similar structures from their repertoire tend to develop faster pattern recognition for appropriate pawn breaks and piece placement than those whose games feature highly varied formations. This is not an argument for playing only one opening forever. It is an observation about how structural intuition actually builds, through repetition and attentive review, rather than through breadth alone. One of the most effective habits you can develop is reviewing your own games with the structure as the starting point. After a game, identify the pawn formation that arose and ask whether your moves were consistent with it. Not whether your tactics were sound, not whether you missed a combination, but whether your strategic decisions made sense given the structural reality of the position. This kind of review builds positional judgment in a way that reviewing only tactical errors does not. It trains you to connect the structural reading to the decisions that followed from it, and over time that connection becomes faster and more reliable. You will know the habit is taking hold when certain things start to feel different during actual games. When you begin to anticipate typical pawn breaks from both sides, rather than being surprised by them, that is structural awareness working. When you can classify a position as open, semi-open, or closed within a few seconds, and immediately associate it with the relevant type of plans, that is pattern recognition maturing into something close to intuition. When you find yourself rejecting an attractive pawn advance not because you calculated its failure, but because the structural consequences feel clearly wrong, that is the evaluation habit becoming automatic. These are not dramatic transformations. They happen gradually, through consistent play and honest review. But they are cumulative and self-reinforcing. Each game where you apply structural thinking correctly makes the next application slightly easier. Each time you catch a structural error before it happens, the pause that caught it becomes a little more natural. The understanding compounds, and the compounding is what makes structural knowledge different from memorized theory. Memorized theory can become outdated or inapplicable. A genuine understanding of how pawn formations work transfers to every position you will ever encounter, regardless of opening, opponent, or how the game develops. Nimzovich argued that positional understanding, built on structural and prophylactic thinking, contributes more to sustained improvement than focusing solely on short tactical combinations. The reason is exactly this transferability. Tactics are often position-specific. A structural principle, once genuinely understood, applies across the entire game. The isolated pawn's weakness does not fundamentally change depending on which opening produced it. The principle that a bishop blocked by its own pawns is a diminished piece does not stop being true in an endgame. The understanding you have built is not tied to specific positions. It is a way of reading the board that will remain relevant in every game you play from here.